911 emergency. Do you need police, fire, or medical?
There was a fire, and we went in to investigate, but there's a dead body in the garage.
Daniel loved family. He always wanted to be a dad. But even as a little girl, Sierra was pretty self-centered and pretty selfish. What she wants, she gets. And nobody's gonna stand in the way.
Welcome back to our YouTube channel.
And we had sex a lot today.
It was worth it. I got plenty of sex over. I was paying for doing it.
It's just stunning, honestly. It's one of the most stunning things I've seen in my career.
What evil resides in a soulless person to do that?
And her 32-year-old husband, Daniel, are driving their 3 children from their home in Las Vegas to Disneyland.
There's the happy little campers on their way to Disneyland. Uh-oh. Wow. She's not happy at all.
It should be every child's dream come true, but 3-year-old Sierra, the youngest, doesn't seem convinced.
I think it really kind of is typical of her. Everybody else is happy, why not her? She has the puppy. She's so unhappy. She's angry, mad. Who knows what about?
There is everybody in Disneyland. There's Sierra right there, now having a good time. There was that crabby little girl to begin with, and now laughing, and there's Dan. That's what he was able to do with her every time.
Yeah.
Look at them go.
Time to head up.
Yep.
Daniel loved family. He loved the idea of family. He loved being a part of a family. He always wanted to be a dad, even when he was little.
Wow, home run!
Oh, man.
Yeah, this is typical Daniel. Daniel loved being around the kids. It was wonderful.
The story of Daniel's family begins in 2000, when he meets Elizabeth Schwarak, a high school senior from Salem, Oregon.
At the time, Daniel was at Western Oregon University. He got his Bachelor of Music degree. When Daniel first met Elizabeth, he was very excited. She came up to the house, and we were all excited because she seemed to just be happy and good for him.
I love you.
But she made Daniel feel like he was her protector, and that fed him that he wanted to be able to look after somebody.
How's Dan feeling?
The couple marry in Salem on July 2nd, 2001, after Elizabeth graduates from high school.
They were very much in love. Our family was very excited. They all showed up for the wedding. Well, it was a beautiful wedding and ceremony.
There's myself and there's my sister. And typical how we do things, we're giving tips to each other, what we should, how life should be.
And I just think marriage is the best thing possible. I've married 7 times myself. Every time it's just been great. Hi, I'm Mog, mother of the groom, and I just got out of prison. I'm really proud to be here for my son.
Waxing eloquent. Oh, it's my sister. She's so happy for her boy getting married.
The newlyweds start a family within a year of tying the knot.
There's the woman in charge.
Their daughter Lucy is born in 2002, and their son Connor in 2003.
Daniel absolutely loved little babies. He loved fatherhood. He was so excited.
A year later, on December 16, 2004, Elizabeth gives birth to her second daughter, Sierra.
He was so tickled to have Sierra, to be a dad to Sierra. Well, Sierra was a cute baby, but was always kind of a mystery. She was just, a difficult child.
In 2006, Daniel is offered an IT job in Las Vegas. The family relocates to Nevada.
He was elated. It was a very good paying job, and it was in the line of what he wanted to do, and so they moved. And the job potential in Vegas seemed to work well for them. I think a plus side in the move to Vegas for them is they had themselves as a unit family to kind of get to know each other.
He had a great time living in Las Vegas, and they loved it there. They really did love it there. Daniel and Elizabeth were both interested in politics.
And they started getting involved in the politics in Vegas, and Elizabeth seemed to really like it, and she really wanted to get more involved. And she found politics as a potential way for her to be her own person. There was a possibility for an opening for a Senate position in the state of Nevada.
Elizabeth decides to run in the 2010 election.
When we heard the news that not only did she run, but she won, we were amazed and we were so excited for her and for Daniel. She was ecstatic. Everybody was just so happy. He was so excited for her. He goes, "This is going to be great. This is perfect because I can stay at home and be with the kids." He had an opportunity of working at home with his children and building that bond that he wanted to have.
I'm Sleeping Booty. That's my name.
Okay.
I'm Sleeping Heiny.
No, we don't want to be heinies.
My name is Princess.
His cohorts would tease him and call him Mr. Mom. Dan, at his core, was a storyteller, and he would share his stories with us through video and music, and he wanted us to feel as if we were in the room with him. So one way of reaching us as family was to share those videos that he would do with them. He'd always send videos. He'd post them in Facebook and invite the family to see these.
Elizabeth's political career took off. She had meetings to go to, and she had to go to Carson City, which was quite a ways away.
Daniel's really concerned, but she said, "I've got a lot to do. I've never done this before, and I really want to, do a good job, and so I'm just trying really hard." But anytime you have a separation, you have that beginning of differences. And so what seemed to happen in this world of politics was a dividing place that seemed to get bigger and bigger. It puts a strain on relationships.
So that was the beginning of the end for those two. It wasn't a good situation. What I remember is that he called me one time and he was angry, which he hardly ever got. Daniel really wanted to save the marriage. So they went to counseling, and it didn't go very well.
So it was clear from what was happening that there was going to be no future to the marriage, and Dan filed for divorce. The family was really concerned about what was going to happen with the family, with Daniel.
Yeah, so Daniel moves into an apartment, and they set up a visitation.
Divorces are hard on children, but especially it seemed different with Sierra.
And I'm so happy that she's spending some time with Daddy and doing some good.
Daniel was concerned about Sierra, and so when they would get together, he would take extra care. It was kind of obvious that she had this withdrawn personality into her own little world. She was kind of standoffish, and he was always trying to bring her in to the fold. But she was a troubled kid. How troubled, we had no idea. When Daniel would get the kids, he'd try to make it special. He'd always have something planned, or else, the week before, they'd say, well, what do you want to do next time? So they always had something to look forward to, and of course, it really helped him to have something to look forward to also.
Okay, what are we gonna eat?
So when he had that time with the children, he wanted to make sure they had the best time ever. And especially Sierra.
Here's little Sierra Bob being so cute and wonderful, because that's what she is. Right, honey?
Yeah.
Because Sierra was actually a very difficult child. I mean, really, that's the only way to describe her. Sierra was, pretty self-centered and pretty selfish, wanting her own way all the time. Sierra would warm up. It would take Daniel half the time he spent to break the wall.
It was the one thing that he found is that music worked, dance worked. Sierra loved to be in the moment and dancing. But that was a special thing that he could do.
In 2012, Elizabeth moved to Alaska with the kids. It devastated my son. And he went from stay-at-home dad to now the kids are up in Alaska, and he might get to see them once or twice a year.
This has been a day of configuration magic. Doing I can to get all this stuff protected, and we're getting there.
Daniel throws himself into his work. His business as an IT consultant takes off. And in 2013, he moves to Texas.
After the divorce, Daniel got a great job, an IT job in Texas, and it worked out really well. He joined a Christian dating site, I think, and he met Donna, who was a lovely woman. So in 2012, Daniel and Donna got married, and then they moved to Texas, and they began a new life. She was a very good wife. She was very loving, and she was really kind to Daniel's kids. She paid a lot of attention to Sierra, actually. She was really kind to Sierra. She was always fixing Sierra's hair, because Sierra had this wild, kind of crazy curly hair.
Daniel and Donna were wonderful together. They were married 7 years and were partners in a business they built together. And then they decided to separate.
They got a divorce in 2019. I mean, nothing really changed except legally they were not married anymore, but they remained the dearest of friends, and she remained very close to our family.
Whatever the reasons were, but we did see that Dan was happy and Donna was happy. They talked 3 or 4 times a day. She still managed all the banking, and so there was always good feeling.
By 2020, Elizabeth and the kids, together with her new husband, have moved back to Las Vegas.
So in March of 2020, Daniel had some business in Las Vegas, and he came to Vegas and stayed with Peggy.
Daniel had a client here, and he still resided in Texas, but he was staying all the time in Las Vegas. And I had known him about 10 years prior. I was his bookkeeper, did his payroll for his company. But basically, he wasn't very much a friend. He's the same age as my youngest child. I felt like he was almost like another son.
In March 2020, the COVID pandemic hits Nevada. All flights are canceled, and the entire state goes into lockdown.
Daniel asked if he could stay at my house for a little while, and a little while turned into a little while longer. And he asked if he could move in. At that point, that's the first time I had heard that Sierra had begun texting him. He was starting to explain these strange messages. She was telling him, communicating that she was in trouble. She was texting him things that were making him concerned, such as, I'm not comfortable here, I'm fearful. It was very vague, though. It wasn't nothing specific, but he was worried about his little girl.
Despite Sierra's claims, there's no evidence that she suffered any mistreatment in her mother's home.
No, then you put your elbows into your sides. Yep, like that, and I'll just rotate.
Woo! Like I almost got it.
In early June, the kids came to my house and they stayed with Daniel in my house. And he had them all to himself. He was absolutely elated and thrilled. He planned a trip back to Oregon so they could be with Grandma and cousins and so forth. And I lent Daniel my car, so he took the kids in my car up to Oregon, and I know they had a good time up there.
And we were all so excited. The cousins are excited, I'm excited, everybody's excited. It was June. It was summery, it was fun. We'd get together and just have a good time, have a barbecue, go on hikes. But Sierra was just odd behavior. There was this whole other side of Sierra that she didn't want known, but it would pop out. So at one of the barbecues, all the cousins got together and sitting there, we're roasting marshmallows and stuff. The kids were sitting around, whining about their parents or whatever, just talking the way teenage kids do. And my younger grandkids, they're like 7 and 9. You know, what do you do when you don't get your way? And the other one says, well, I get mad or whatever. And Sierra just says, well, you just get rid of them. And they all looked at her like, what? Daniel wanted us to really love Sierra, to not think anything was wrong. What I noticed about Sierra after they moved to Alaska and then moved back to Nevada, she did this very odd behavior where she would see you and she wouldn't act friendly at all, and then all of a sudden she'd come up, put her arms around you and hang, let the weight off her feet and hang around your neck. And she would just stay there, like stay hanging there. It was this weird behavior. There was no love behind it, is the odd part about this. There wasn't love, I'm glad to see you. It was, I'm gonna hang on you and make you feel really uncomfortable, and then I'm gonna be kind of in charge. It worked because now she's the center of attention.
When it was time for the 3 children to return to their mother's care, it was toward the end of June. There was an arranged drop-off, a fast food restaurant. That's where he would pick up the children and that's where he would drop them off. And he never dropped them off or picked them up without the mother being there. When they got there, the 2 children got out of the car, but not Sierra. Sierra chose at that point not to join her mother, and with Daniel's permission, she chose to come back to my house with Daniel. I knew about all the phone calls and all the, I'm not happy at home, I'm afraid, all those things she was telling her dad.
Daniel petitions the court for custody of Sierra.
Daniel thought, she was in trouble. I thought she was in trouble. We all fell for that line, and we believed her. She was able to manipulate the situation pretty good. And she knew how to get to her dad, and she did a good job of it. She knew how to get to him. Daniel knew that he was not going to succeed in getting custody of Sierra if he didn't live in Sierra's school district. And I was purchasing a house anyway in that school district. So we decided that would be an opportunity for he and Sierra to move into the house and rent it. During that time, Daniel met Carrie probably saw things more firsthand than most of us.
I met Daniel on social media. We both were living in Vegas, and we decided to meet up. Daniel was really easy to talk to. He became my best friend. The first time I met Sierra was at the house. She was really quiet. She didn't really say much. When Daniel introduced us, he was like, I think you guys will be good for each other. And for Carrie to show you a few things and just lighten her up a little bit. He definitely wanted me to take Sierra under my wing and help her with her self-esteem, her confidence. I just wanted to do the big sister thing and help her. I'd be like, Sierra, let's do our makeup. Let's put some clothes on and go take Instagram pictures. You know, just the normal things. Anything that you can do to distract a teenage girl.
Daniel and Elizabeth fight for custody of Sierra in court.
All right, we are on the record in 454-565. Sir, your name?
Daniel Halstead.
Representing yourself today, sir?
Yes, sir, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning. Ma'am, your name?
Elizabeth Helgeland.
All right, you're also representing yourself?
Correct, Your Honor.
All right, we are on today. Well,
Daniel was ordered by the judge to return Sierra to her mother's, and Daniel did return Sierra to her mother's. But she ran away from her mother's and went back to her dad's.
I honestly think that Sierra was putting up the front. At her mom's, there was two parents. So she couldn't really do what she wanted to do, as opposed to being at her dad's where he was lenient. And, you know, I think he had a little bit of the guilty dad syndrome.
Sierra said she wanted to live with my son, to really get to know her dad again. She wanted to rekindle, but it was totally manipulative. In October 2020, Daniel was going out of town, so I was going to spend a week. And the first night, Sierra starts leaving the house. She thought I was asleep. And I said, Sierra, where are you going? She says, I'm going to take a walk. And it was like, I don't know, 9 at night. And so I called Daniel and I said, you know, she's sleeping all day and then she takes off at night. And he did not know that. She was totally lying to him. So the first time I heard about Aaron Guerrero was in October of 2020 when I went to visit Sierra. I said, does your dad know about this? And she says, oh, but no, but he will.
She met Aaron online. And Daniel was very concerned about his 15-year-old daughter dating an 18-year-old young man.
He was concerned about the impression that Aaron made on Sierra. He just simply didn't think that it was a good idea for them to be together. And, you know, she had every right to. He had discovered that they were planning to rob his parents and run away together. So he reached out to Aaron's parents, and his parents also agreed that they weren't to see each other anymore. Her not being able to see Aaron, I'm pretty sure initially was hard for the both of them. But Sierra said that she didn't miss him, she didn't care anymore, and it was history to her. When you're a teenager, you know, your attention span is only so much. So I believed her.
In December 2020, Daniel and Sierra celebrate her 16th birthday.
Oh my gosh. Oh, snowy. Oh, that looks kind of fun.
Things were definitely looking up. Compared from when I first got there, how depressed and withdrawn she was. She was coming out of her shell, and just doing more normal teenage girl things. And then she just withdrew out of nowhere. For the most part, she was wearing a mask because she just didn't want us to catch on to what was actually going on. She was so good at hiding the fact that she was still talking to Aaron.
On March 2nd, 2021, Daniel and Elizabeth attend Sierra's latest custody hearing.
After taking evidence, I just ripped the child out of Dad's home and put the child solely in Mom's home. That is a possibility, but something needs to happen at this point in time.
Which parent Sierra will live with remains undecided.
Sierra did not want to go back to her mom's, like point blank period. Like, she always expressed that she did not want to go back.
Three weeks later, Carrie leaves Vegas for a trip to Texas. Daniel flies to Boston on business at the same time. Sierra will be alone at the house.
Hi friends, I hope you're having a beautiful day. I just was driving back from an airport and I am in Boston Common, which has one of the, probably the most friendly squirrels you're ever gonna find on the planet.
I won't say that we felt 100% comfortable about leaving Sierra alone, but he had to do what he had to do to provide. You know, that is what his job called him to do. And he wanted to trust Sierra.
Daniel returns to Las Vegas on Wednesday, April 7th. On his way home from the airport, he posts this photograph of a billboard.
You know, every day was a new day to him. Daniel was very optimistic and trusting. Daniel really wanted to believe that Sierra could be trusted. He definitely never would have imagined that it would turn out like this, that anything would happen to that magnitude.
Daniel's mom, Christine, calls her son's phone. No answer.
So I can't get a hold of Daniel. I texted Sierra, and Sierra says, well, his phone's not working. I texted Sierra back, this isn't making any sense. Where's your dad? Either get him on the phone or I'm gonna send somebody to check. So I call Peggy.
On April 8th, Thursday evening, I get a call from Christine, and she's very frantic and concerned because she can't reach Daniel, and that's real unusual. That he didn't answer his phone. Daniel's very communicative.
Peggy promises Christine that she and her friend, Joey Bulick, will check on Daniel the following day.
Joey lived with me. He had a room in the garage. Friday morning, I'm on my way over there and I call Joey because I'm concerned about showing up at Daniel's house alone.
I'm still not hearing from Daniel, and so I send Sierra another text. He's in the shower, and it was like a weird time of day. And I said, no, he's not in the shower, Sierra. I say, do I need to call the police? Joey and Peggy are on their way, and no response.
I'm in the driveway. Joey's van pulls up in the back. We start walking up to the house. He's ahead of me, finds the doors open, not locked. He opened the door, and the whole house is full of smoke. We both run upstairs, and you were yelling Daniel, and no response. We both come downstairs. And around the corner, he opens the garage door, and he gasped. He was visibly very upset. And I peek in, and I see what appears to be a body on the floor.
(911) emergency. Do you need police, fire, or medical?
There was a fire, and we went in to investigate. The fire must be a couple days old. With the homeowner that doesn't live here. But there's a dead body in the garage. Who was in a medical? No medical. The girls do.
425.
Joey actually thought it was Sierra. I think Joey was still on the phone with 911 when the first policeman got there. The fire department shows up too.
613, they got about 4 or 5 trucks here, so the next 5 minutes you can just stage on that street.
On April 9th, 2021, police arrived over at Dunphy Court. This is a single-family residence, the house of Daniel Halseth and his daughter Sierra. And when the police arrive, they find a body in the garage. It was terribly burned.
Oh, man. Pretty...
So, is this the only body right here, or is there another one?
We have not been upstairs.
Okay.
But if you look at...
And would you say he's a 16-year-old male?
I don't think so.
No.
It was difficult for first responders and police to determine exactly, whether it's a male or a female. Detectives go to the Clark County Medical Examiner's office and attend the autopsy. At the time, the body is unknown, but ultimately, the medical examiner's office confirmed that it is Daniel Halseth. The cause of death is sharp force injuries. There are approximately 70 sharp force and incise wounds to Daniel's body, which is an enormous amount of stab wounds. Approximately 42 of them are located around the head, neck, upper shoulder areas. One of his wrists appears as if it was partially dismembered, as if someone tried to literally saw through Daniel to take him apart. There was no soot found inside Daniel's lungs. What that means is when that fire was started, Daniel was not alive. Or he would have been breathing in the smoke and it would have been inside his lungs. Daniel is dead, and the arson is an effort to conceal the crime.
It was the detective who called me. At the end, the detective said he'd been murdered, and all I could think of was it fast? Did he suffer? I was sitting at my kitchen table, and my boys were there. And then I hung up the phone. And my boys were crying, and they hugged me, and we all just held each other, and it was horrible.
The evidence in the home tends to suggest that Daniel was in all likelihood on his couch in his living room. There were absolutely no signs of forced entry. In fact, in this case, the front door actually had a key in it. There are mops sitting on the sides of the wall. There are bottles of bleach and cleaning agents everywhere. You additionally had a saw, a table saw. In addition, there actually was a chainsaw as well, and it appeared brand new, not used. There are saw blades and all of these random items kind of strewn about, and it really just looks like a very hurried, panicked attempt to clean up and potentially burn down the whole house that is for some reason getting cut short. Whoever was in there doing this essentially just drops what they're doing and takes off and leaves. The police also locate a series of bank receipts. One of the receipts was a Bank of America receipt. Police locate that particular branch here in Las Vegas, and they acquire video surveillance. That angle shows Sierra Halseth very clearly driving up in what appears to be Daniel's car. And she is the one that, in fact, withdraws $600 at about 9:59 in the morning on April 8th. One of the things that investigators noticed from the footage is that she's not alone. Someone else sitting in the front passenger seat of the car, and that person is wearing a short sleeve t-shirt that is pink or light red in color.
Investigators discover store receipts, also from April 8th.
One came from a Home Depot, and the second one came from a Winco. When they go to that particular Home Depot to collect video footage, it's very clear that Aaron Guerrero is buying a number of items that are found inside that house. That circular saw, the extra saw blades for it, he's purchasing it. He's purchasing drop cloths, disposable gloves. What's also significant is exactly what Aaron is wearing, a light red pink t-shirt, just like the figure that's sitting in the front passenger seat when Sierra is making her way to the Bank of America. The police also end up going to a Winco. It's very clear that Sierra pulls up at approximately 2:50 in the morning, close to 3 a.m. in the morning on the 8th. She walks in, she buys the bleach, and she drives away and she leaves. You know, do we have a definitive match that either one of them struck a killing blow at this stage? No. But when we look at the significance of all of those receipts, plus the video footage, at this point, it's very clear that these are the two main suspects that are responsible for Daniel's murder. On April 9th, the detectives in this case prepare arrest warrants not only for Sierra Halseth, but Aaron Guerrero as well. And that warrant issued into a national database that alert all law enforcement agencies to let authorities from an outside jurisdiction know, hey, Aaron and Sierra are actually wanted for murder. Let's not let them go.
5 days after Daniel's murder, CCTV records Aaron and Sierra in Salt Lake City.
About 8:35 in the morning on the 13th, transit police encounter Aaron and Sierra using a tram. They're making out. They're just kind of living their best life on the tram in Utah. What happens essentially is they're asked for their tickets, and they don't have any tickets. The transit authority asks them for their name or identification, and Aaron and Sierra provide it. They run a name check, up pops the warrant. And so Aaron and Sierra are taken into custody by Utah Transit Authority for the murder of Daniel, and are promptly then ultimately brought back to Las Vegas. They get caught by just simply giving over their names and not paying for a tram ticket. When Aaron and Sierra are taken into custody, one of the things that's in their possession is a cell phone. That phone is forensically downloaded by the police.
My hair's short.
There is videos on that phone. There are photographs taken by Aaron and Sierra, just kind of chronicling their little trip through Utah. You know, taking pictures of one each other, little videos of them kissing and giggling and just having the best time. But the most stunning part about what's found on the phone is a particular video.
I don't know what to say.
Welcome back to our YouTube channel. Day 3 after murdering somebody.
Whoa! Don't put that on the camera.
It was worth it.
And we had sex a lot today.
It was worth it. I got plenty of sex over it. I was payment for doing it.
It's shocking. I mean, there wasn't an ounce of remorse in Sierra's face. It's just stunning, honestly. It's one of the most stunning things I've seen in my career, because they are just laughing.
Investigators pieced together the sequence of events from when Daniel returns home from his business trip in Boston on Wednesday, April 7th.
We believe that Daniel is on that couch. He's asleep when they attack. Daniel is stabbed approximately 70 times by Sierra and Aaron. Two of the items, among a vast number of other things, that were collected and ultimately tested for DNA were the two folding knives. On one knife, Sierra Halseth's DNA is found. On the other knife, Aaron Guerrero's DNA is found. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Sierra's going out to a Winco and she's buying bleach. That suggests to us that at this point she's trying to clean up what's happening. By the morning time, it appears they've come up with a different plan. And part of that plan involves dismembering Daniel, because that's when they are purchasing circular saws and additional things, when they're picking up drop cloths and disposable gloves. And that's what Aaron's doing over at the Home Depot. It's very clear, though, that whatever they were planning to do, all of that abruptly comes to a halt by 10:42 in the morning on the 9th. Because that is the point where Christine sends text messages to Sierra saying, "Do I need to call the police?" And with that essential threat being made by Christine, that is what prompts them to drop everything, dousing him with lighter fluid in the garage, and try to burn Daniel in a sleeping bag. And ultimately, they make off with Daniel's car, make off with some chunks of money out of his bank account, and they head off on a road trip to Utah. Killing Daniel was unnecessary. If Sierra and Aaron simply wanted to go run away together, like Romeo and Juliet, they could have simply taken the car keys and taken Daniel's car and driven away. But for some reason, they chose not to do that. They waited for Daniel to come back home, and then they killed him.
You know, someone who knew Dan well said, even now, Daniel would forgive her. He loved her. He would forgive her.
Compete with yourself to be a kinder person, a more loving person, somebody that doesn't give up.
He was such a wonderful, wonderful person. And she's spending the rest of her life, hopefully, in prison. What a horrible thing she did.
She took away my Danny boy. She took away my oldest son, or my son's brother. She took away so much joy and so much light. He was like a light. She took away a big chunk of my heart that will never be returned. I just have to learn to go on without him.
October nights in Northern California are supposed to feel gentle. The air cools just enough to make porch lights look softer. Neighborhood windows warmer, the ordinary rhythm of family life more precious without anyone noticing. In Petaluma, the streets settled into that kind of evening on October 1st. 1993, with the quiet confidence of a town that believed it knew itself. Front yards rested behind low fences, trees shifted in a mild breeze. Somewhere a television glowed blue behind curtains. Somewhere else, dishes were being dried and stacked. It was a Friday night, the kind of night that persuades parents to loosen the day's rules and let childhood stretch a little later than usual. Inside one modest home, a 12-year-old girl named Polly Kloss was doing what children have done for generations when the week finally breaks open into weekend freedom. She was staying up late with her friends, telling stories, laughing at little things that would not sound funny to adults, filling her room with the safe, bright noise of being young. There is something especially painful about a night that begins so normally. Evil is almost never announced by thunder. It enters quietly, through the unlocked assumption that life will continue in the same shape tomorrow, long before the police cars, before helicopters carved circles into the dark, before volunteers pinned missing child flyers to telephone poles and storefront windows. There was only a girl in her bedroom and a mother in another part of the house, each of them moving through a familiar routine that did not yet know it was becoming the last ordinary memory. The room itself would later be described in practical terms by investigators, but practical language has a way of bleaching life out of places. What mattered in those first untouched minutes was not evidence, but atmosphere. A sleepover creates its own small universe. There are blankets half folded, half kicked aside. There are little piles of belongings. Socks, snack wrappers, hairbrushes, maybe a borrowed sweater, maybe a flashlight, maybe a cassette playing low in the background. A child's bedroom at that hour is full of signs that tomorrow exists. Clothes are set aside for the morning. Plans hover unfinished in the air. Someone says they are not tired, and someone else laughs because everyone is tired. The future is assumed in 100 tiny, careless ways. That is what makes what happened next feel so bottomless. It did not just interrupt a life, it invaded the most innocent idea human beings protect. The belief that a child is safest at home, in her own room. With the door closed against the night, Polly was 12. Standing on that fragile threshold between childhood and adolescence, old enough to have her own tastes and opinions, young enough for the world to still feel structured by adults who would step in if danger came too close. People who knew her remembered a girl with spirit, imagination, and a gentle awkwardness that made her seem both ordinary and unforgettable. She loved acting. She had a theatrical streak, the kind that made emotions vivid and the world a little larger than it looked from the outside. Children like that do not simply occupy a room. They animate it. They bring weather with them. Their excitement changes the air. Their worries dim it. Their curiosity opens it again. On that Friday night, the house held that living current. It was not a crime scene. It was a place where a child felt entitled to be carefree. The terrible power of this case lies partly in how quickly the scene changed without changing at all. Walls remained standing, lamps still glowed. Furniture stayed where it had always been, and yet after one intrusion, every familiar object became haunted by contrast. The bed became the place she had been taken from. The doorway became the place someone had crossed with violence in his mind. The window, the hallway, the floorboards, the staircase, the front of the house. All of it would be pulled out of ordinary time and pinned forever to one night. This is how horror often works in real life. It does not arrive in ruined castles or distant landscapes. It chooses a room with posters on the wall, a hallway that smells faintly of detergent, a town where people know the nearest grocery store by heart. It chooses places that were built for daily life, then leaves them permanently unable to return to innocence. To understand why the kidnapping of Polly Klaas burned itself into the American conscience, you have to begin with that contrast. The distance between the softness of the setting and the violence of the act. Petaluma was not imagined as the edge of nightmare. It was a community with school routines, sports practices, local diners, small frictions, small celebrations, all the rituals that make a town feel less like geography and more like a shared agreement. Parents there feared the usual things. They worried about grades, friendships, traffic, scraped knees, bad influences. The 1,000 manageable threats that seemed to define responsible adulthood. But the image of a stranger entering a child's bedroom during a slumber party and taking her at knife point belonged to another category entirely. One that tears through every reassuring story a community tells itself. It was the kind of crime that instantly forces every parent into a private theater of terror. They do not only think about the victim, they see their own child's room. They picture their own hallway after midnight. They hear the imagined creak of a floorboard. They wonder whether the simple acts that make up love, tucking in a blanket, checking a lock, calling goodnight from the doorway, could ever be enough. And that is why this case spread beyond county lines and state lines with such force. It was not only about one family, though one family carried the deepest wound. It struck at the architecture of trust itself. The intruder who entered that house did not merely commit a kidnapping. He shattered the border between domestic safety and random predation in the years before smartphones and instant alerts transformed the way fear travels. This story still moved with astonishing speed because it awakened something primal. A child had vanished not from a dark roadside, not from a remote place, not after wandering alone for hours, but from home, from bed, from the center of what should have protected her. There is another reason the opening of this case remains so devastating. Childhood has its own acoustics. When children are gathered together late at night, the world sounds different around them. The house feels both smaller and more magical. Hallways become tunnels between one safe zone and another. Shadows are only shadows because adults exist elsewhere in the structure. Every laugh carries a secret confidence that morning is guaranteed. The kidnappers and killers who prey on children destroy more than bodies and futures. They weaponize that confidence. They make every remembered detail unbearable afterward. The laughter becomes a prelude. The pajamas become a symbol. The half-finished conversation becomes a wound with no closure. Somewhere in that house, time divided itself into a before and an after without anyone hearing the split. That is the place where our story begins. Not with headlines, not with mugshots, not with legal arguments, but with an ordinary knight stepping unsuspectingly toward catastrophe. If you had stood outside the Kloss home a little earlier that evening, you would not have seen anything that announced history. You would have seen a family house in a peaceful town, lit from within. You might have passed by and thought of nothing at all. That is part of what makes true crime. At its most honest, so difficult to tell. The danger is not only in the offender. The danger is in the recognition that terror can emerge within scenes that look exactly like our own lives. Every notorious case begins as someone else's normal evening. Every future headline first exists as an unremarkable hour. Then one decision, one movement. One intrusion turns the whole night into evidence. For Polly Kloss, the world would remember the official facts, the date, the age, the town, the manner of abduction, the search, the trial, the verdict. But before the official story hardened into national memory, there was a living child inside that story. And that distinction matters. Cases like this are often repeated until the victim becomes a symbol. Then a cautionary tale, then a chapter in the history of public fear. Yet symbols do not leave shoes by the bed. Symbols do not laugh with friends over the kind of secret joke that dissolves by morning. Symbols do not have mothers listening from another room, half present, half busy, comforted by the sound of life continuing as it should. The first duty of any retelling is to reverse that flattening. We have to return the room to its warmth before we describe how it was violated. We have to feel the weight of the innocence before we trace the violence that followed. Only then can the crime be seen for what it really was. Not merely shocking, not merely famous, but intimate in its cruelty, because the man who entered that house carried more than a weapon. He carried a willingness to turn a child's final moments of ordinary happiness into the opening scene of a national nightmare. And yet even the word nightmare can mislead. Nightmares end with waking. Families torn apart by crimes like this wake into the same reality over and over again. Each morning delivering the same absence for the Kloss family. The first horror was not the full truth, because the full truth was still hidden in darkness. The first horror was uncertainty. It was the sick, impossible interval in which hope and dread begin to wrestle with each other. Maybe she will come back. Maybe this is not what it looks like. Maybe someone saw something. Maybe the police will move fast enough. Maybe the night has not already taken what it came for. That kind of uncertainty is its own form of violence. It drags every second. It makes every ringing phone an event. It teaches the body to fear silence. And in the first chapter of this story, that uncertainty wraps itself around everything. around the mother who will soon realize something unthinkable has happened, around the friends whose memories of the bedroom will never again feel harmless, around the officers arriving at a house where the ordinary details have not yet surrendered their meaning, around a town that has not yet learned its name is about to be spoken by news anchors across the country. The darkness outside that night was not cinematic darkness, not the dramatic blackness of fiction. It was suburban darkness, thin in places, broken by street lamps, by porch lights, by the glow of homes where families were brushing teeth, setting alarms, saying, "See you in the morning." That is what made it so cruel. The world did not pause. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, then stopped. A car passed. A refrigerator hummed in some other kitchen. The machinery of ordinary life kept moving while one household crossed into a reality from which it could never fully return. This is where we enter the case, at the edge of that crossing. When the warmth of childhood still lingers in the room and the cold shape of violence has only just begun to emerge. In a few moments, the night will no longer belong to sleepover laughter, to the private theater of girls talking late under soft light. It will belong to fear, to searching, to police radios, to interviews, to a community learning the hard way that safety is not a feeling but a temporary condition, one that can be stolen in a single breath. And at the center of that theft is Polly Klaas, 12 years old, suspended forever in the American memory between who she was and what was done to her. A child whose story begins not with darkness, but with a room full of life just before the door was opened. What makes the opening of this story endure is not only fear, but helpless proximity. The danger was close enough to hear breathing, close enough to cast a shadow in a doorway, close enough to turn familiar walls into witnesses. There are crimes that horrify because they are monstrous in scale. And there are crimes that horrify because they happen at arm's length from love. This was the second kind. A mother was home, friends were present. The rituals of care were all around, and still a predator found the narrow gap between trust and preparedness, stepped into it, and changed everything. That image, even before the nation knew the offender's name, was enough to lodge itself in the public imagination like a splinter that could not be pulled free. For parents, it was unbearable because it suggested that vigilance itself had limits. For children, though many were shielded from the full details, the case introduced a colder map of the world. Bedrooms no longer seemed entirely sealed from danger. Closed doors became symbols with cracks in them. Adults began checking windows twice, then 3 times, measuring locks with anxious fingers, standing in hallways a little longer before finally going to bed. Fear moved into everyday gestures. That is how one crime ripples outward. It does not remain in the house where it happened. It enters neighboring homes in altered routines, in newly tightened rules, in conversations held after children have gone to sleep. It changes the emotional weather of entire communities. And still, within that widening circle of fear, it is important to hold close the smallest truth of all. At the center of the story was a child on the verge of a weekend, a girl with friends nearby and a future already leaning toward her. A child whose life should have continued into countless ordinary tomorrows. The magnitude of what was stolen can never be measured only by the crime itself. It must also be measured by birthdays not reached, roles not played, friendships not carried into adulthood, arguments not had, reconciliations not needed, laughter not heard again. The hook of this case is not simply that something terrible happened. It is that something terrible forced its way into one of the most innocent scenes imaginable, and in doing so, exposed how fragile ordinary happiness can be when it meets a determined human darkness. In that sense, the hook is simple and merciless. A child should have been unreachable there. A mother should have been enough. Friends should have made the room safer, not more tragic. But the night ignored every should. It moved forward with the indifference of reality. And by dawn, one family's terror had become the kind of story that makes a country pull children closer and look at the dark. Petaluma in the early 1990s carried itself with the layered calm of a town that had survived enough change to appreciate routine, about 40 miles north of San Francisco. It sat in that stretch of Sonoma County where California could still feel rural, even as modern life pressed closer from every direction. Mornings came with fog lingering low over fields and roads, then burned off into a cleaner light that made clapboard houses, old storefronts, and schoolyards seemed storybook from the right angle. Downtown preserved traces of another century. Brick facades and shop windows that suggested continuity, while the neighborhoods beyond it were threaded with the small domestic signs of late 20th century American life. Station wagons in driveways, basketball hoops over garage doors, bicycles left on lawns, school backpacks dropped near front steps. It was a place where people still liked to believe that community could function as a kind of informal shield, that being known by neighbors, teachers, shopkeepers, and other parents formed a web strong enough to catch trouble before it became catastrophe. It was embedded in habits. It lived in the way children were allowed to move from one house to another under the loose supervision of adults who recognized each other's names. It lived in the confidence with which parents arranged sleepovers, carpools, and weekend errands. It lived in the ordinary assumption that danger, if it came at all, would come from somewhere else, somewhere less familiar, less rooted, less touched by the reassuring repetition of local life. That assumption was not unique to Petaluma, of course. It was woven into much of America at the time, especially in places that seemed just far enough from major urban turbulence to imagine themselves spared the worst kinds of violence. Streets bent quietly through residential blocks where porch lights turned on at dusk and stayed on long enough to welcome someone home. School calendars and church events, sports leagues and community fundraisers gave the year a rhythm that felt communal rather than chaotic. Rolling hills and open patches of land on the edges of town softened the sense of crowding. The wind carried the smell of damp earth at certain hours, and by evening there could be a chill in the air that made family houses feel more intimate from the inside. Each one a pool of warmth against the dark. Against that background, the Kloss household belonged to the emotional geography of the town. It was not a mansion, not a fortress, not the kind of place built to keep the world out. It was recognizably human in scale, the sort of home where life collects in visible layers. Family houses always tell on themselves if you know how to look. Shoes by the door, notes on counters, a stack of school papers, laundry that has been folded but not yet put away, a refrigerator marked by magnets, reminders, maybe a child's drawing curling at the corners. The details differ from house to house, but the meaning remains the same. This is where people return when the day is done. This is where they let their guard down enough to become fully themselves. That is why the home matters so much in this story, not just as a location, but as a psychological setting. Before it became associated with one of the most haunting child abduction cases in American memory, it was simply the place where a family lived, argued, laughed, forgot things, found things, made plans, postponed chores, and trusted the nights to pass without incident. To understand Polly Kloss as more than a name in a case file, you have to enter that world before it was broken. She was not an abstraction inside a national news cycle. She was a girl growing up within the warm untidiness of real family life. By the age of 12, children begin to carry multiple selves at once. There is the child they still are at home, the one who can drift from room to room without self-consciousness. And there is the emerging adolescent, suddenly aware of image, belonging, embarrassment, performance, secrecy. Polly stood inside that in-between space. Those who knew her described a child with imagination and emotion close to the surface. Someone drawn to creativity, especially acting. Someone whose personality could fill a room in unpredictable bursts. That matters because the victim in a story like this must not be reduced to vulnerability alone. Polly was vulnerable because she was a child, yes. But she was also lively, specific, developing, full of private futures that had begun taking shape. At 12, every preference starts to matter intensely. Music becomes more than background noise. Friends become mirrors and judges and companions all at once. Bedrooms become extensions of the self, places where posters, clothes, books, journals, and scattered belongings form a rough map of identity. A sleepover at that age is not only entertainment, it is ritual. It is social testing ground, confessional booth, theater stage, and miniature republic. Alliances are rehearsed there, embarrassments are confessed there. Fears are laughed at there. Children perform confidence for each other in ways they cannot yet sustain in daylight. Polly's world, then, was not only the world of parents and school schedules, it was the vivid interior world of girlhood, where weekends carried a charge all their own, and the late hours felt like a temporary independence granted under the umbrella of safety. Her family life, like most real family lives, was not a polished postcard. Real homes breathe through complication. Parents separate, reconcile, struggle, improvise. Money can be tight. Time can feel fragmented. Expectations rub against fatigue. Yet children do not need perfection to feel anchored. They need familiarity. They need recurring gestures of care. They need a sense that their room is theirs. Their home is theirs. Their people are within reach. By all accounts, Polly had that sense of being held within a family world that, however imperfect, was real and loving. The tragedy of this case is sharpened by that intimacy. What was taken from her was not only life in the abstract, but life in context, her place in that household, her part in its routines, her growing presence in a town that still had years left to watch her become herself. Outside the Kloss home, the early 1990s were a peculiar moment in American culture. A hinge period between older assumptions and newer anxieties. The country had already lived through publicized cases involving missing and exploited children. Names had entered national consciousness. Television news had learned how to transform local tragedies into national rituals of fear and concern. Parents were already hearing more often that the world was not as safe as earlier generations had believed, yet there remained a gap between broad cultural anxiety and intimate personal expectation. People could worry in theory while still believing, deep down, that their own routines would be spared. Petaluma existed inside that gap. It was not naive in some cartoonish sense. People locked doors. They paid attention to headlines. They understood that crime existed. But understanding crime as a social fact is very different from expecting it to enter your child's bedroom. That emotional distance is what this case would collapse overnight. The California of that moment also matters. The state had long sold itself as a land of reinvention and openness, with suburban growth pressing into landscapes that still advertised pastoral calm. Northern California, in particular, could present itself as both progressive and rooted. Modern but neighborly, communities around the Bay Area lived close enough to urban complexity to know the world was changing, yet far enough to imagine that the texture of small-town life still offered insulation. Petaluma's identity drew partly from that balance. It was not isolated, but it felt local. Not untouched by the wider world, but buffered from it. The result was a kind of civic body language, relaxed, sociable, reasonably trusting. A child's sleepover fit naturally within that environment. It did not read as risky. It read as healthy, normal, almost wholesome in the old-fashioned sense, and the season deepened that feeling. Early October carries its own emotional tone. Summer's brightness has loosened. School is underway again. Days are still active, but evenings begin to gather more quickly, bringing a sense of enclosure that can feel cozy rather than threatening when you are safely indoors. There is a special domestic softness to autumn weekends, especially in family neighborhoods. Dinner lasts a little longer. Indoor lights matter more. Children sense both freedom and shelter for a 12-year-old. That combination can feel perfect. You are old enough to stay up late, young enough not to fear the dark if you are surrounded by friends. So when we picture the setting of this case, we should not see a stage preloaded with menace. We should see an environment almost designed to generate ease. That ease is essential because it explains both the shock and the symbolic power of the crime. Crimes that become cultural turning points often do so because they contaminate something many people share. In this case, it was not merely a house in Petaluma. It was the larger American idea of the safe suburban childhood weekend, the belief that a girl in pajamas at a sleepover inside her own home belonged to the category of protected life. Polly herself embodied that category in the eyes of the nation once the case exploded into view, but within her immediate world, she was simply Polly. A daughter, a friend, a student, a child on the cusp of becoming more fully herself. Her personality mattered in ways the public could only glimpse through fragments. She liked performance, which means she likely understood something about mood, attention, and transformation even at that age. Children drawn to acting often possess a heightened sensitivity to tone. They read rooms quickly. They improvise. They imagine alternate selves. They are often both expressive and vulnerable. Eager to be seen, yet not always prepared for what being seen can mean. That detail does not explain the crime, but it deepens the loss. There would have been so many versions of her future still waiting to unfold. The outgoing one, the shy one, the dramatic one, the adult she might have become after surviving adolescence. Disappointments, first loves, reinventions, all of it was still unwritten. The setting of the story therefore includes not just place, but possibility. Her room, her town, her friendships, her family life. All of these formed the first draft of a future the offender would brutally erase before the violence. The house would have sounded like a real home on a Friday night. Cabinets opening and closing. Water running briefly in a sink. Someone moving down the hall. A distant murmur from another room, laughter rising suddenly. Then falling, maybe the rustle of blankets. The shuffle of feet on carpet, the small negotiations children make about where to sit. What to talk about, whether anyone is getting sleepy. Adults often hear these sounds without fully hearing them because they are signs that all is well. Noise inside a family home is often a reassurance. Silence is what makes people look up. That is another reason this case feels so intimate. It began in sound before it was reduced to fact, somewhere amid the ordinary noises of the evening. Terror entered, but before we arrive there, it is worth lingering in the before, because the before is what makes the after morally legible. When people recall notorious crimes only through the machinery of investigation, they risk treating the event as inevitable, as though the case existed fully formed from the moment the first police report was written. It did not. It emerged from a living environment full of detail that had nothing to do with crime until crime forced every detail to change its meaning. A hallway was just a hallway. A bedroom was just a bedroom. A Friday sleepover was just a Friday sleepover. The task of this part of the story is to hold on to that innocence long enough to feel its weight. Communities like Petaluma do not merely provide backdrop. They produce certain emotional expectations. They teach children how far they can roam, how loudly they can laugh, how completely they can assume the presence of care. They teach parents what kinds of risk are reasonable, what kinds of vigilance are enough. Those teachings are invisible until a crime disproves them. Then every local memory begins to reorganize itself around a wound. Streets once remembered for bike rides become linked to searches. Public spaces become flyer locations. The town's name becomes inseparable from the event. Petaluma would undergo that transformation, but on the night our story approaches, it was still the older Petaluma, the one arranged around normalcy. And inside that normalcy was Polly, held not by national symbolism, but by the immediate scale of a child's life. Friends nearby, family nearby, the cozy tyranny of bedtime delayed, the sweet self-importance of being 12 and awake too late on a school year weekend. This is the world that must be seen clearly if the crime is to be understood in full. Not because the offender deserves a more dramatic entrance, but because Polly deserves to be restored to the setting from which she was taken. She belonged to a home with familiar sounds, to a town that believed in everyday safety, to a season that wrapped the evening in domestic warmth, to an age when the future still arrives in countless trivial forms. Tomorrow's clothes, next week's classes, a future argument with a parent, a future role in a school play, a future sleepover, a future embarrassment that would later become a funny story. The background of this case is built from all those unwitnessed tomorrows, when the nation later saw her photograph and learned the outlines of the abduction. What it felt, even if inarticulately, was the collapse of that background. The crime did not happen in emptiness. It happened in the center of a child's ordinary world, and that world, before it was broken, looked a great deal like the world millions of families believed they knew. That is why the setting matters so profoundly. It was recognizable. And because it was recognizable, what happened there would not remain local for long. The nation would soon look at Petaluma and see not just one town, but a mirror held up to its own assumptions. Yet before the cameras, before the search teams, before grief turned public, the background remained tender and almost unbearably normal. A Northern California autumn evening, a family home lit from within. A 12-year-old girl with her life still opening in front of her, and a town sleeping under the old belief that childhood, at least in places like this, could still be trusted to remain safe through the night. Before a child becomes the center of a national tragedy, she belongs first to the small kingdom of ordinary life. She belongs to the morning reluctance of getting out of bed when the room is colder than the blankets. She belongs to the half-finished breakfast, the misplaced homework, the sudden laughter at something no adult in the room fully understands. She belongs to the familiar negotiations of home, to voices calling from one room to another, to the private theater of friendships, to moods that rise and fall quickly because childhood feels everything with an honesty adulthood often forgets. That is where Polly Klaas must be met if her story is going to be told with any fairness. Not at the moment the world learned her name. Not in the grainy repetition of news footage, not in the frozen sadness of a missing child poster, but in the living texture of who she was before violence tried to reduce her to a single terrible event. Polly was 12 years old. And 12 is an age full of unfinished weather. It is an age when a child can still seem very young one moment and startlingly older the next. When imagination and self-consciousness begin sharing the same skin, there is still softness in the face, still traces of early childhood in certain expressions, but there is also a new inwardness. A sense that thoughts are becoming private territory. A 12-year-old can be theatrical without meaning to be, wounded by small things that adults miss, fiercely loyal to friends, embarrassed by affection in one breath and hungry for reassurance in the next. That in-between quality matters because it reminds us that Polly was still in motion, still becoming. Her life had not settled into any final shape. It had only just begun to sketch its outlines. People who knew her remembered a girl with imagination, sensitivity, and a dramatic spark that seemed tied to how intensely she experienced the world. She loved acting, and that detail opens a window into her more effectively than any official description ever could. Children who are drawn to acting are often children who feel deeply. They notice tones of voice. They understand, even before they can explain it, that human beings change depending on who is watching them and what the room asks of them. Acting lets them experiment with identity before life makes identity feel fixed. It offers permission to be larger, bolder, funnier, sadder, stranger than they might otherwise dare to be. For a child like Polly, performance was not only entertainment, it was probably a language, a way of reaching toward the world and asking it to see her. You can imagine her in a school setting, perhaps energized by the thought of a role, attentive to costumes, lines, moments of applause. You can imagine the way she might have carried stories with her after other children had moved on to something else, replaying scenes in her head, adding emotion, giving shape to moods that were still too big and unnamed. Children who love drama often make their surroundings feel more vivid. A bedroom becomes a stage. A mirror becomes an audience. A hallway becomes an entrance. They rehearse not only lines, but versions of themselves. That kind of imagination is part of what was lost, and it is also part of what must be restored when telling her story. Polly was not simply vulnerable, she was expressive. She was alive in specific ways. She had preferences, tones, energies, silences. She had the quicksilver emotional life of a girl standing at the edge of adolescence and trying, as all children do, to understand what kind of person she might become. Family life forms the first landscape of a child's identity, and Polly's story cannot be separated from the atmosphere of home that held her. Home is rarely tidy in emotional terms. Families are made of love, impatience, routine, fatigue, affection that goes unspoken because it is assumed. A child learns herself in fragments there. She learns which room feels safest when she is upset. She learns which adult voice means comfort, which means discipline, which means the day is ending and everyone needs to settle down. She learns what her own footsteps sound like in the hallway, where the floor creaks, where the light reaches when the bedroom door is left partly open. These are intimate geographies. They matter because they become the invisible architecture of trust. Polly lived within that architecture. The walls around her were not symbols. They were familiar boundaries. The routines around her were not abstractions. They were daily proof that she had a place in the world. At 12, that place is everything. A child that age is beginning to test independence but still returns constantly, almost unconsciously, to the need to feel held. Even the defiance of that age depends on security. A slammed door only means something because there is a home outside it. A child can roll her eyes, complain, demand privacy, and still remain deeply rooted in the knowledge that someone will check whether she has eaten, whether she got home, whether she is asleep. The presence of that care, even when imperfect, shapes every ordinary evening. It shaped Polly's. And beyond family, there was friendship, that intense and delicate world that governs so much of preteen life. Friends at 12 are not casual companions. They are co-authors of identity. They witness the version of you that parents do not fully see. They understand the urgency of things adults dismiss. They know who likes whom, who is pretending not to care, who is secretly afraid, who wants to seem brave. Sleepovers, in particular, become little islands of emotional freedom, under the excuse of staying up late and having fun. Children tell each other the truths they cannot quite carry in daylight. They confess crushes. They invent futures. They test sarcasm, confidence, style. They talk until words become softer and less guarded. If Polly invited friends into her room that night, she was opening the door not only to company, but to that special intimacy children build when they believe themselves sheltered from the larger world. In that space, she would have been most fully herself, not the public version of a child, but the relaxed, playful, unfiltered self that appears among trusted peers. There is a cruelty in what happened that can only be felt when you remember that her final ordinary hours unfolded inside precisely that kind of safety. Before the national headlines, there was the ordinary happiness of being together late at night and thinking the world had narrowed to a private circle of trust. Polly's story is also the story of a girl living in that subtle transition from being protected to believing she understood protection. At 12, children begin to absorb the language adults use about safety without really grasping its limits. They know to be careful. They know strangers can be dangerous. They know rules about doors, roads, curfews, and calling home. But those lessons remain general until reality gives them shape. Most children still assume that danger is something that belongs outside the perimeter of home. That assumption is not ignorance. It is a developmental form of faith. It is part of what allows childhood to feel livable. Polly likely shared that faith in the way children do, not as a conscious belief, But as a background condition, her room was where she slept, dreamed, hid from embarrassment, talked with friends, kept the objects that made up her world. It was where she could close the door and assume the rest of the night would remain on the other side of it. That assumption was one of the things stolen from her. And from countless children and parents who later heard her story, but before it was stolen. It was real, and it is important to honor that reality instead of letting hindsight erase it. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to let the future leak backward, to describe victims as though they were already under the shadow of what would happen to them. Real life does not work that way. Polly did not glow with tragedy in advance. She did not move through her days as a symbol. She was a child concerned with child-sized and preteen-sized things, with feelings that mattered immensely in the moment and would have seemed almost charmingly small from a distance. Perhaps she worried about how others saw her. Perhaps she felt suddenly grown up in one context and painfully childish in another. Perhaps she was the kind of girl who could be exuberant one hour and withdrawn the next. All of that belongs to the truth of who she was, because children are not pure emblems of innocence. They are complicated long before adulthood arrives. Their complexity is part of their humanity. To respect Polly is to imagine that complexity rather than flatten it. It is to remember that she had an inner life. No crime report could ever fully recover. Maybe she lay awake some nights rehearsing future versions of herself. Older, more confident, more admired. Maybe she studied people the way young performers often do. Collecting expressions, voices, gestures. Maybe she cared deeply what her friends thought. Maybe she could become suddenly serious after a period of joking. Maybe she was sensitive to disappointment in a way that made small hurts feel enormous. These possibilities do not sensationalize her life. They humanize it. They remind us that what was taken was not just existence, but continuity. The chance to keep growing into and beyond those moods, talents, insecurities, and hopes. In family photographs and remembered descriptions, children are always frozen slightly unfairly. A single image can make them look shy, solemn, mischievous, older than they were, younger than they felt. The real child moves between expressions too quickly to be captured. Polly would have had that same fluidity. One moment bright, another guarded, one moment theatrical, another uncertain. The adults around her may have thought they had years left to understand the person she was becoming. That is one of the hidden devastations in crimes against children. Parents lose not only the child they knew, but the future understanding they were supposed to earn over time. They lose the older teenager who would have revealed more of herself. They lose the adult who might one day have explained what childhood had felt like from the inside. They lose all the later conversations that would have turned mystery into familiarity. For Polly's family, the girl they loved remained forever at an age of becoming, forever on the verge of future selves that never arrived. And yet the tragedy should not swallow the girl whole. Before she became the subject of searches and court proceedings, she had a child's appetite for ordinary pleasures. A sleepover mattered. Staying up late mattered. The private glow of friendship mattered. The silly and serious blurred together in the way they do for preteens. Life was still full of small landmarks, an upcoming event, a class at school, a role she might dream of, a weekend plan, a shifting friendship, a family conversation that seemed important then and would probably have been forgotten later. That is what a living child's timeline looks like before it is cut short. It is cluttered with details too minor for history and too precious for grief to bear. The more closely we imagine that texture, the more unbearable the loss becomes, but also the more honest the telling. Because the point is not only that Polly was innocent, it is that she was particular. She was not innocence in general. She was her own combination of temperament, curiosity, sensitivity, and desire. She occupied space in a way no other child could exactly duplicate. She changed the emotional weather of rooms simply by entering them. That is what all children do in their own ways. And it is what all violent crimes against children attempt to erase. They do not merely end a life. They interrupt an irreplaceable pattern of presence. In Polly's case, that interruption struck so deeply because there had been such vivid life right before it. She was not alone in some abstract narrative of danger. She was surrounded by the visible signs of being loved and known. Her room held the traces of personality. Her evening held the energy of friendship. Her town held the quiet assurance of routine. She was rooted in a real human world, and it is that rootedness that makes the violence feel not only cruel, but desecrating. The child at the center of this story was supposed to go on becoming herself. She was supposed to wake up the next morning tired from staying up too late. She was supposed to move messily into adolescence, gathering memories that would one day feel small and funny and formative. She was supposed to look back on 12 as an awkward, tender age she had survived. She was supposed to have the luxury of outgrowing her room, outgrowing certain friends, outgrowing her first performances and her first versions of herself. She was supposed to have time to embarrass herself, time to be forgiven, time to refine whatever talent had first drawn her toward acting, time to change her mind about who she wanted to be. That stolen time is part of her story, too. When a child dies, people often speak in the language of potential because it is one of the few available ways to measure the unmeasurable. But potential can sound vague if it is not grounded in the specifics of a person. Polly's potential lived in her expressiveness, in her imagination, in her emotional intensity, in the ordinary development of a girl whose life was already beginning to announce itself. Somewhere inside her were future performances, future arguments, future tenderness, future reinventions. The story of the victim is therefore not a pause between setting and crime. It is the moral center of the case. Everything that follows, the terror, the search, the courtroom, the public outrage, derives its meaning from who she was and what her life meant to the people around her. Without that center, the crime becomes spectacle. With it, the crime is returned to its true scale, an assault not only on safety, but on a child's singular existence. So when we speak her name here, it should not sound like a headline. It should sound like someone being called in from another room, like someone whose family knew the rhythm of her footsteps, like someone her friends expected to keep laughing beside them for years to come. Polly Klaas was 12 years old. She loved acting. She lived inside the ordinary, fragile beauty of childhood. She was someone before she was a case, and that is how she must remain as this story moves toward the darkness that tried and failed to take even that from her. The night turned without warning. One moment, it still belonged to the private universe of girls talking late in a bedroom. The next, it belonged to the cold logic of a man who had already decided that their fear was something he could use. Inside the Klaas home on October 1st, 1993, Polly and her friends were gathered in the room with the loose, drifting energy of a sleepover that had pushed past ordinary bedtime. The house had settled into its nighttime sounds. Quieter now, more enclosed. Each room seeming farther from the others in the way homes often do after dark. Laughter had softened into conversation. The bright confidence of evening had begun to dim into that slower hour when children feel both daring and drowsy, when every whispered story sounds more intense than it would in daylight. Nothing in the room announced the approach of violence. There was no cinematic omen, no dramatic noise from outside to prepare them, no instinctive surge of alarm rising early enough to matter. There was only the ordinary stillness of a family home, and beyond it, a stranger moving through the dark with purpose. The intrusion was sudden because most real terror is, it does not pause at the threshold and identify itself. It appears inside a moment that has not yet had time to defend itself. A man entered Polly's bedroom armed with a knife. The scene that followed has remained one of the most haunting aspects of the case because of its intimacy. This was not a public abduction snatched from a parking lot or a roadside. It happened in the tight, enclosed space of a child's room while her friends were there beside her. The offender did not merely seize an opportunity. He imposed himself on a small circle of childhood trust and broke it apart in seconds. To the girls in the room, the figure before them would have seemed almost unreal at first, not because he was theatrical, but because the mind resists absorbing danger when danger appears where it is not supposed to exist. A bedroom is one of the first places in life where children believe they possess a border. The door closes, the light changes. The outside world stays outside. For that border to be crossed by a stranger with a blade in his hand was to make the entire logic of safety collapse at once. What did they see in those first seconds? A shape in the doorway. Then a face, an adult male body filling space that should never have belonged to him. A knife catching light, a voice low and threatening enough to erase any doubt that this was real. Panic in children does not always explode immediately into screaming. Sometimes it freezes first. The body tries to understand before it tries to escape. The girls were confronted not only by danger, but by a form of authority twisted into terror. An armed adult entering a room of children at night carries the force of command even before he speaks. He can turn the air heavy just by standing there. Every child in the room would have felt the same impossible pressure at once. The urge to scream, the urge to stay still, the urge to wake up from what was somehow already happening. The offender controlled that moment by weaponizing fear. By making it clear that one wrong move could bring the knife closer, he ordered the girls to comply. He bound Polly. In many retellings, the details of those moments are compressed into a single sentence, but compression can make the violence feel too abstract. What happened in that room unfolded not as one clean event, but as a sequence of ruptures. A child realizes the stranger means what he says. Another child sees Polly being restrained and understands, in a way no child ever should, that the game has ended and there is no hidden adult about to step in. Hands shake, breathing goes thin and fast. Eyes search the room desperately for an answer that is not there. The intruder's commands become the only structure the moment has left. That is one of the ugliest truths about coercive violence. It narrows the world until obedience feels like the only imaginable path through the next few seconds. For children especially, that narrowing is almost total. They have not yet built the adult instinct to calculate outcomes under threat. They only know that danger is present and close enough to cut skin. Polly's friends survived that night, but survival in such a context does not mean escape from harm. To witness the kidnapping of a friend at knife point is to have innocence split open in front of you. Those girls were forced into helpless proximity with evil. They were close enough to see, to hear, to remember details that would cling to them long after the house was emptied of officers and reporters, even in later life. Memory often preserves such moments with cruel clarity. The angle of a shoulder, the way carpet looks under weak lamplight, the exact quality of a threatening voice, the strange calm that can descend in the center of fear, the way a friend's face changes when she is trying not to make things worse. In that room, at some point, the offender separated Polly from the safety she had left. That separation is the heart of the incident. A child was taken not only from her home, but from the immediate presence of her peers, from the last witnesses who still belonged to her ordinary world. The movement from room to hallway, from hallway toward exit, from inside to outside, must have felt unreal in the way trauma often feels unreal while it is happening. A house at night contains familiar shadows, familiar doorways, familiar corners, under threat. All of that familiarity turns against the victim. The very map of home becomes the route of removal. Each step away from the bedroom would have deepened the unreality, as though the structure that had always meant protection were now delivering her into darkness instead. And beyond the door waited the wider night, the open space outside the home where the offender's control could expand. It is impossible to reconstruct every feeling Polly experienced in those moments, and any honest retelling must acknowledge that limit. But some truths stand close enough to reason that they can be felt without invention. She would have been terrified. She would have known she was being taken somewhere she did not want to go by a man whose willingness to invade her room had already shattered every safe rule she knew. She may have hoped someone would hear, hoped her mother would appear, hoped the danger would somehow break apart before she was carried fully beyond reach. Children under threat often continue hoping long after adults imagine hope would vanish. They cling to the possibility of interruption. Rescue, mistake. Mercy, that hope is part of what makes crimes like this so devastating. The victim is not simply overpowered physically. She is pulled through a sequence of shrinking possibilities, each one closing behind her before she can fully absorb that it is gone. Somewhere in the house, the balance between noise and silence changed. The room Polly had left behind no longer contained the ordinary sounds of a sleepover. It contained the stunned after silence of children who have just seen the world behave in an impossible way. That silence can be louder than screaming. It is made of disbelief, of shock, of the body lagging behind the event. Then comes the burst of motion. The frantic need to tell an adult, the collapse of paralysis into action. Fear changes temperature quickly. 1 second it is cold and immobile. The next it is hot and chaotic for the surviving girls. The realization that Polly had actually been taken would have landed with crushing force. A stranger had entered. He had threatened them. He had taken their friend. The sentence is simple now because history has arranged it into order in lived time. It would have felt jagged, impossible, badly assembled by a reality that had stopped making sense when Polly's mother learned what had happened. The night crossed another threshold. Until then, the incident had belonged mainly to the children in the room and the man who had forced his will upon them. The moment an adult heard and understood, private terror became family catastrophe. There is a particular horror in realizing that danger was moving through your own house while you were still inside it. Close enough to intervene in theory and yet not in time. The mind goes immediately to self-accusation because love always imagines it should have been able to do more. Did I hear something? Why did I not know sooner? Could one different movement, one earlier check, one louder sound have changed everything? Such questions are part of the wound from the beginning, and they arrive before facts have even settled. A parent in that moment is not thinking in legal categories or procedural timelines. A parent is thinking only that her child has been taken out into the night by a man with a knife, and every second now feels criminally large. Outside, Petaluma remained for a brief time what it had been earlier that evening, a town under darkness. Houses mostly closed, neighbors living unaware inside their own routines. That contrast is one of the cruelest elements of the incident. While one family entered the worst night of its life, other homes nearby still held normal Friday endings. Televisions were being turned off. Lights were going out. People were brushing teeth, setting alarms, sleeping. The wider world had not yet learned that one of its assumptions had just been violated. It is always jarring how long normalcy can continue in one place while disaster is already underway in another. The offender moved through that ordinary darkness with his stolen victim, and for those first crucial minutes, there was nothing visible in the neighborhood landscape dramatic enough to match the scale of the crime. No sirens yet, no floodlights, no public alarm, just a child being carried out of her own life while the town around her still slept inside the old illusion of safety. The offender's control during the abduction depended not only on the knife, but on speed, surprise, and the paralysis of others. Crimes like this often take less time than memory later allows. That is part of what makes them so hard to bear. A family can lose its entire world in the space of minutes. Children can have childhood divided into before and after almost faster than they can name what is occurring. The man who took Polly exploited exactly that kind of compressed terror. He entered, threatened, restrained, removed. Each action fed the next. By the time the house could react, he had already created distance. And distance is what predators understand. Every additional second beyond the doorway makes retrieval harder. Every house length, every yard, every turn into darkness widens the gap between victim and rescue. What began in a bedroom was now moving outward into the larger geography of roads, vehicles, hiding places, and time lost. And yet the incident should not be imagined only from the offender's perspective of control. It should also be seen from within the emotional fracture he left behind. In the bedroom, the remaining girls had been forced to watch helplessness become reality. In the house, a mother was trying to understand the unbearable. In the first minutes after the abduction, language itself would have felt inadequate. How do children describe a knife in a room where only whispers had been a moment earlier? How does a parent repeat the fact aloud without hearing it as madness? The home itself had been altered in an instant. Doorways became points of violation. The room became both evidence and wound. The very air seemed different after violence has passed through it, as though the house has inhaled something it cannot release. Objects remain in place, but the meaning has fled them. A blanket is no longer just a blanket. A bed is no longer just a bed. Everything is split between what it was minutes ago and what it has become now. This is the incident at the center of the case. Not a mystery at first, but a violent fact. A stranger entered a child's room during a sleepover, threatened the girls with a knife, bound Polly Klaas, and took her from her home into the night. That plain account is terrible enough, yet even it cannot fully contain the emotional size of what occurred. Because the true force of the moment lies in its betrayal of place. The bedroom was supposed to be one of the safest locations in a child's life. The friends in the room were supposed to increase safety simply by being there. The mother in the house was supposed to mean that catastrophe could not unfold unchecked. The neighborhood outside was supposed to belong to the ordinary darkness of a quiet town. Every one of those assumptions failed within minutes. The incident was not only an abduction, it was a dismantling of trust at every level. Personal, domestic, communal. The last image of part 4 must stay there. At the edge of the house, behind him, the violated room, the stunned children, the first rising panic of family. Ahead of him, the roads and darkness that would turn a local emergency into a statewide search and a national case. And in between, Polly, 12 years old, carried out of safety and into uncertainty by a man who had already shown that he understood exactly how to use fear. That crossing, from bedroom to night, from home to disappearance, is the true hinge of the story. Everything after it, every search party, every clue, every press conference, every courtroom word, unfolds because of those few compressed minutes in which the ordinary world was forced open and a child vanished through the wound. The incident endures in memory because it feels like a theft committed in layers. First, the offender stole the calm of the room. Then he stole the girl's sense that adults always arrive in time. Then he stole a mother's confidence in the walls around her child. Finally, he stole Polly herself, leaving behind not emptiness, but a terrible surplus of fear, questions, and images no one present would ever fully set down. That is how the night truly changed, not with a single motion, but with a chain of irreversible losses that began in seconds and would echo for years. Within those minutes, childhood, parenthood, and home itself were all made to feel fragile, as though the dark outside had learned every name inside the house. The first minutes after a child disappears do not feel like the beginning of a case. They feel like the collapse of reality into fragments that refuse to line up. Inside the Klaas home, after the stranger had gone and the bedroom had been left behind in stunned silence, the air itself must have seemed altered, as if fear had weight now. As if it had settled into the carpet, the blankets, the walls. The surviving girls had seen enough to know that something unspeakable had happened. Yet they were still children, still trapped in that bewildering space between experience and language. They had watched an armed intruder enter a room that should have belonged only to whispers and late-night laughter. They had watched him bind Polly. They had watched him take her away. Now the room held the afterimage of all that terror. The bed was still there. The familiar belongings were still there. But the life of the room had been ripped out of it. Any ordinary object now seemed transformed by contact with violence. A pillow no longer meant comfort. A sheet no longer meant sleep. The floor did not simply hold feet. It held the memory of a stranger's steps. The bedroom had become both wound and witness. When Polly's mother realized what had happened, the private horror of children turned instantly into the wider panic of adults. This was no longer a fear that could be calmed with reassurance. There was no misunderstanding to correct. No childish exaggeration to gently sort into something manageable. A man with a knife had entered the home and taken a 12-year-old girl into the night. That sentence, once spoken aloud, must have seemed impossible even to the people saying it, yet impossibility did not soften the urgency. It sharpened it. Every second after that realization took on unbearable meaning. Somewhere outside, distance was growing. Somewhere in the dark, a man who had already crossed every human boundary that mattered was moving farther away with a child. That is the atmosphere in which the first discovery of a crime scene truly occurs. It is not calm observation. It is terror trying to think. The initial response inside the house would have carried the frantic rhythm of disbelief colliding with action. Calls had to be made. Facts had to be repeated. Rooms had to be checked even when logic already knew the answer. Sometimes the body still behaves as if the missing person might somehow reappear in a closet, under a bed, behind a door left slightly open. The mind is slower than catastrophe. It keeps offering impossible escapes from reality because accepting reality all at once feels lethal. But there is a point when panic gives way to procedure. When the house that was a family home minutes earlier becomes a place, officers must enter carefully, observe closely, and preserve. That shift is one of the cruelest in any violent case. The living space of memory is overtaken by the machinery of investigation. Shoes change the sound of the hallway. Radios replace domestic quiet. Flashlights glance across surfaces that had once meant nothing at all. Officers must see things not as the family sees them, but as evidence might reveal them. Where was the intruder standing? What did he touch? Which route did he take? What was moved? What was left behind? The room begins to separate into two overlapping realities at once. The family's emotional reality, which is grief and panic and prayer, and the investigative reality, which is pattern, entry point, trace, sequence. In cases like this, both realities are true and neither can erase the other. The bedroom where Polly had been taken was immediately central because it contained the last intact frame of her known presence. Whatever the offender had done there, whatever he had touched or disturbed, might hold the first practical clues to where he came from and how he moved. Yet for the family and for Polly's friends, that same room was also sacred in the worst possible sense. It was the last place she had been among the ordinary protections of her life. Investigators would have needed to absorb details quickly, while those who loved her were still drowning in the meaning of them. The initial crime scene in a kidnapping is often profoundly deceptive. It may appear almost too normal. There may not be the kind of chaos people expect from violence. That very lack of visible destruction can be its own horror. A home can look nearly intact and still have been shattered. In the Kloss house, investigators would have been alert to every sign that the intruder's actions had compressed terror into a few efficient minutes. The layout of the room, the condition of bedding, the positions of objects, the statements of the surviving girls. All of it mattered. A bedroom after a sleepover is naturally disordered. And that ordinariness creates a challenge. Which disturbance belongs to children living their lives, and which belongs to the offender? Which shifted blanket or displaced item is innocent, and which marks coercion? The smallest trace can matter because crimes committed under pressure often leave behind tiny betrayals. Fibers, impressions, accidental contact, a partial gesture frozen into material form. In this case, one of the early physical clues would become particularly important. A smudge palm print left on a door, a trace so modest at first glance that it might almost seem forgettable to anyone outside the discipline of criminal investigation. But scenes speak through such modesties. A violent offender can enter and vanish into darkness. yet still leave behind the involuntary record of having existed in that exact place, at that exact moment. Before that clue would acquire its later significance, it would have appeared as one piece among many in an atmosphere of acute uncertainty. The first officers on the scene were not looking at a solved puzzle. They were looking at a child taken from her home under circumstances so brazen that the possibilities immediately widened in terrifying directions. Was the offender known to the family? Was this random? Had he been watching the house? Had he entered on impulse or with planning? Was Polly specifically targeted or selected in the moment? Every one of those questions mattered, because each implied a different map of danger. If the offender knew the family, then the threat might lie somewhere within their visible world. If he was a stranger acting opportunistically, then the danger was broader, colder, more difficult to predict. In the first phase of a case like this, uncertainty is not merely a lack of information, it is an active force that shapes every decision. Investigators must move fast without knowing which assumptions are safe. Family members must answer questions while in shock. Witnesses must revisit terrifying seconds and try to make them coherent. The surviving girls were critical witnesses, but they were also traumatized children. What they had seen had to be gathered carefully. Every remembered detail, the intruder's appearance, his voice, his clothing, his movements, the knife, the way he behaved in the room, could matter enormously. Yet memory under extreme fear is both sharp and unstable. Certain features burn in with painful clarity while others dissolve immediately. A child might remember the blade vividly and struggle with the face, or remember the smell of the intruder's clothing, the texture of his voice, the command in his posture. While losing track of timing altogether, investigators had to work within those limits, drawing out what could be trusted while knowing that terror itself changes how the mind records events. Outside the house, the first ripples of the case were beginning. Emergency response in a child abduction depends on speed, not only because of publicity, but because time is evidence. Fresh tire tracks can fade. Witnesses can fall asleep. A passing driver who noticed something odd may forget it by morning if not asked in time. The neighborhood around the Kloss home, so ordinary earlier in the evening, now had to be reimagined as a possible field of clues. Streets that had carried only night traffic and quiet routine now became possible routes of escape. A yard might hold footprints. A nearby road might have seen a suspicious vehicle. The darkness itself became suspect, not as atmosphere, but as cover. Every minute that passed between the kidnapping and the full mobilization of search efforts deepened the urgency. The first discovery phase of this case therefore reached beyond the bedroom quickly. It included the immediate surroundings, the search for entry and exit points, the attempt to establish the offender's path through the house and away from it. Was there forced entry? Did he come through an unlocked point? Did he leave in a vehicle? Was there evidence he had prowled before entering? Investigators in such moments are trying to force sequence out of shock. Sequence matters because sequence is the beginning of comprehension, and comprehension is the only path toward rescue. Yet beneath all that procedure lay a harder truth. The scene was already telling them something terrible about the offender. This was not a crime of distance or hesitation. A man had stepped into a child's bedroom occupied by multiple girls and taken one of them at knife point. That act revealed boldness, desperation, or both. It suggested someone willing to risk immediate detection, someone prepared to dominate children face to face, someone who understood the power of speed and fear. Those behavioral clues are part of a scene too. Investigators do not read only objects, they read audacity. They read the psychology implied by method. An offender who commits a home invasion abduction of a child under these circumstances is signaling something deeply dangerous about his threshold for violence and control. The crime scene in that sense was not silent. It was already describing the kind of mind that had moved through it. The family, meanwhile, had entered the first suspended hours of not knowing, the hours that are often more unbearable, because hope still survives there. As long as Polly had not been found, there remained the possibility of return. of discovery alive, of interruption before the worst. That hope does not make the scene less tragic, it makes it more agonizing. Every clue becomes overloaded with emotional meaning. A print on a door is not merely a print. It is maybe the beginning of finding her. A remembered detail from one of the girls is not merely testimony. It is maybe the thing that will bring her back. A neighbor's sighting. A sound. A car. A shape in the dark. All of it becomes charged with desperate significance. This emotional pressure surrounds the initial discovery phase of every major child abduction, and it can be felt in the house itself. Rooms fill with urgency, but also with restraint. People want to search wildly and touch everything. Yet the scene must be protected. People want to believe every possibility. Yet investigators must sort what is useful from what is panic. The early hours are therefore crowded with contradiction. Hope and dread, speed and care. Chaos and discipline. The Kloss home on that first night would have embodied all of it. There is also the transformation of community perception, which begins almost instantly once police presence becomes visible. Neighbors who notice patrol cars, movement, lights, officers entering and exiting, understand at once that something is terribly wrong, even before they know what. In a town like Petaluma, news would have traveled quickly from person to person. First as fragments, then as a chilling whole. A child, a kidnapping. From home, at knife point. Each added detail would have made the case feel less like a local disturbance and more like a rupture in the town's emotional fabric. But at the center of that widening awareness remained the immediate, practical work of the scene. The house had to yield whatever it could. The room had to be documented. Witness statements had to be preserved. Time had to be fought for, even as it was already being lost. Looking back, people often search the early hours of famous cases for a dramatic clue that stood out like prophecy. Real investigations are usually more humble than that. They begin in uncertainty, with partial traces and frightened witnesses and a terrible awareness that the victim may still be alive if action is fast enough. That was the emotional and procedural landscape of the discovery phase here. Not revelation, not certainty, but urgency sharpened by the knowledge that a child's life might depend on details small enough to smear onto a door or remain trembling in the memory of another child. The first crime scene in the Polly Kloss case was not only the site of a kidnapping. It was the first battlefield in a race between evidence and distance, between memory and darkness, between the offender's head start and the investigator's need to understand him before the night widened too far. And all the while, in the center of that effort, one fact remained devastatingly simple. The room where Polly had been laughing with friends only a short time earlier was now the room where everyone stood looking for her absence to explain itself. It could not. It could only hold the marks of violation and wait for human beings to read them well enough and fast enough to follow the trail out into the dark. In the first days after Polly Kloss vanished, the investigation expanded faster than certainty. That is often how major child abduction cases begin. Public attention accelerates everything, but attention does not equal clarity. Instead, it creates a storm of motion around a center that remains painfully empty. Officers, detectives, volunteers, journalists, frightened parents, neighbors, and strangers driven by sympathy all converge on the same question. Where is she? And the sheer volume of concern can make the case seem almost flooded with possibility. Yet possibility is not the same thing as progress. In fact, too many possibilities can become their own trap, pulling time and energy toward shadows that feel urgent in the moment and irrelevant by morning. That was the shape of the investigation in its early phase, a race not only against the offender's head start, but against confusion itself. The case exploded into public consciousness because the facts were instantly terrifying and instantly legible. A 12-year-old girl had been taken at knife point from her bedroom during a sleepover. There was no complicated backstory needed for the nation to understand the emotional stakes. The image alone was enough. The result was a surge of nationwide attention that brought both force and distortion. Tips flooded in. Sightings were reported. Suspicions multiplied. Every possibility had to be considered because when a child is missing, no responsible investigator can casually dismiss information in the first rush, but the cost of that necessity is enormous. Thousands of details arrive with the emotional weight of hope attached to them, and most turn out to be smoke. Detectives had to absorb that pressure while maintaining discipline, which is harder than it sounds when a community is watching and a family is waiting. The immediate investigation relied on multiple fronts at once. Witness statements from the girls in the room had to be refined and revisited. Physical evidence from the house had to be analyzed. The surrounding area had to be canvassed. Anyone with a history of violent crime, sexual predation, burglary, prowling, or suspicious behavior in the region became relevant. Registered offenders, parolees, local drifters, recent arrestees, anyone whose movements could not be quickly explained, all entered the widening orbit of suspicion. That widening was necessary because the crime itself suggested a dangerous blend of audacity and mobility. The offender had invaded a home, confronted multiple children, used a knife to gain compliance, and left with his victim. Such a man could not be assumed to belong neatly to any one category. He might be a stranger passing through. He might be a local predator. He might have been watching the house. He might have selected Polly opportunistically. He might have had a long criminal record, or almost none. Each version of him implied a different strategy, and early on, the investigation had to pursue many of those strategies at once. This is where dead ends begin to multiply. One report suggests a suspicious vehicle, so officers chase ownership histories, interview possible drivers, reconstruct timelines, and find nothing solid. Another tip places a child resembling Polly in a distant town, generating immediate urgency, cross-jurisdictional contact, hurried verification, and then collapse into misidentification. A known offender seems geographically plausible until his alibi holds. A local man behaves strangely under questioning. But strange is not the same as guilty. A transient drifts through a county and leaves behind rumor more than evidence. Each lead temporarily brightens the emotional landscape of the case, giving families and the public the unbearable sensation that something might finally break open. Only for the light to die again. Investigators learn to live inside that whiplash. Families are forced to endure it. The Kloss case became one of those investigations in which hope was repeatedly ignited by partial signals and then extinguished by fact. Public mobilization added another layer of complexity. Searches spread outward. Posters appeared. Volunteers worked roadsides and fields. Tips arrived from across California and beyond. Publicity can be essential in a missing child case, but it also generates projection. People see what they fear. They remember things more dramatically after learning the facts. Harmless men become suspicious in hindsight. Ordinary vehicles become sinister because they happen to pass through a neighborhood at the wrong hour. The investigation had to sort through all of that without losing time, which is one of the most punishing features of high-profile cases. Every wrong direction is not just intellectually frustrating. It costs hours, manpower, emotional strength, and sometimes strategic focus. And all the while, the family lives inside a state of suspended devastation, watching the case gather mass without yet producing the one thing that matters, Polly herself. There was also the problem of offender type. In the absence of immediate identification, detectives had to infer psychology from method. Home invasion child abductions are comparatively rare and deeply alarming because they reveal a willingness to cross multiple risk thresholds at once. The man who took Polly did not lure her from a public place or exploit an isolated moment outdoors. He entered an occupied house and asserted control in front of witnesses. That suggested brazenness, but brazenness can emerge from different sources. It can come from predatory confidence, from intoxication, from desperation, from a lifetime of escalating criminal behavior. or from some combination of all four. The investigation therefore had to balance behavioral analysis with brute force police work. Detectives could say the offender seemed willing to dominate and threaten, but that description still fit many dangerous men. The question was which man and where. The physical evidence from the house became crucial, partly because witness memory alone could not carry the case. The surviving girls had seen the offender under acute fear. And while their recollections mattered enormously, trauma shapes perception in uneven ways. One may remember the knife most vividly, another may lock onto the man's build or hair or voice. Age, stress, lighting, and shock all affect recall. Investigators had to compare and refine these descriptions carefully, aware that public hunger for a clear suspect sketch often exceeds what child witnesses can reliably provide. That tension haunts many child abduction investigations. The public wants a face. The case yields fragments. Meanwhile, detectives must resist the temptation to overcommit to a composite certainty that the evidence does not yet support. As pressure mounted, the investigation increasingly moved through familiar corridors of frustration. Criminal databases were examined. Prior offenders were reviewed. Regional law enforcement agencies were looped in. Men with histories of burglary and violence became especially relevant because the offense combined intrusion with control. But having the right offender category does not mean having the right offender. Investigative history is full of cases where police are effectively standing in the correct neighborhood of criminal behavior while still miles away from the right door. That appears to have been true here in the early stages. The man who took Polly would later fit recognizable patterns, but at the time, he was hidden within a much larger field of dangerous possibilities. Dead ends are rarely dramatic while they are happening. They feel plausible. That is why they are costly. A detective follows one line because it genuinely might matter. A witness statement seems to align with a tip. A local offender lacks a solid explanation for his movements. A vehicle description overlaps with another report. Momentum gathers just enough to justify resource allocation. Then some hard fact arrives and collapses the structure. The man was elsewhere. The timing fails. The vehicle was unrelated. The witness was mistaken. The tip came from rumor rather than observation. In a national case, these collapses happen repeatedly. And each one leaves behind fatigue that cannot be publicly acknowledged for long because the next lead is already arriving. Investigators must project steadiness even as the ground beneath their working theories keeps shifting. For the family, that cycle is its own cruelty. Every apparent advance tempts hope back into the room, and every dead end teaches hope to be more afraid of itself. Media attention complicated everything further. News coverage kept the case alive, which mattered, but coverage can also flatten investigative reality into a false rhythm of imminent breakthrough. Audiences are taught to expect progress because narrative demands progress. Real investigations often produce only movement, and movement can be mistaken for meaning. Press conferences, released sketches, calls for public help, statements about active leads. All of that can sound like the edge of resolution, when in fact the case remains deeply uncertain. The Polly Klaas investigation lived under that tension. The world was watching. And the act of being watched exerts pressure on every choice. Detectives must decide how much to reveal, what to hold back, when to ask for help, how to protect the integrity of witness information, how to avoid contaminating the case while still mobilizing the public. Every release of information shapes the terrain. Reveal too little and you may miss a useful tip. Reveal too much, and you may feed false confessions, distort memory, or alert the offender to what police know. These are not abstract concerns in a case like this. They are strategic dilemmas unfolding while a child remains missing. One of the most agonizing features of the investigation was the uncertainty about whether Polly was still alive. In the earliest phase, investigators had to proceed as though rescue remained possible. That imperative changes how cases are handled. Search areas expand differently. Alerts are framed differently. Leads that might otherwise seem marginal receive urgent attention. Yet the very nature of the crime also forced detectives to confront darker probabilities. An armed abductor who takes a child from her home at night presents a terrifying risk profile. Investigators know this, families know this. The public senses it even when no one says it aloud, so the investigation moved through a terrible dual consciousness. Work as if she can be found alive, fear what the offender's behavior may already imply. That emotional contradiction sits at the center of many child abduction cases and shapes every dead end into something sharper. Each failed lead is not just failure. It is time passing under the shadow of the worst possibility. As the case broadened, attention increasingly turned toward men on the margins, parolees, transients, repeat offenders, those whose lives already carried the smell of prior violence. That focus was logical. Crimes like this are often committed by men with histories, and law enforcement must go where pattern suggests danger lives. But there is a danger in pattern too. The obvious suspect pool is large, and lives at the margins are often surrounded by rumor, misinformation, and institutional familiarity that can make a man seem closer to guilt than evidence supports. Some suspects emerge because they truly fit. Others emerge because chaos needs a vessel. The investigation had to discriminate between the two. And not always with the luxury of time. The palm print found at the scene existed in the background of this process, like a stubborn promise. It was something physical, something the offender had involuntarily left behind. Something immune to public fantasy. But a latent clue is only as useful as the system's ability to connect it to the right individual. Fingerprint and palm print comparisons depend on databases, quality, process, and circumstance. Investigators could know they had something real without yet knowing to whom it belonged. That gap between possessing evidence and possessing an answer can stretch unbearably in active cases. It means the truth may already be in hand and still remain inaccessible. In the meantime, detectives keep working through human possibilities, interviewing, re-interviewing, cross-checking, discarding, returning, chasing the edges of suspicion. Fatigue becomes a hidden character in the investigation by this stage. Not surrender, not complacency, but weariness of a particular kind. The mind becomes crowded with names, tips, partial alibis, timelines, criminal histories, maps, witness statements, media demands, and the ever-present awareness that a child's life has been shattered at the center of all this paperwork and procedure. Detectives learn to compartmentalize because sentiment cannot drive good analysis. Yet no serious investigator in a case like this is untouched by the victim's age or the cruelty of the method. That emotional undercurrent can either deepen resolve or distort judgment if not controlled. The best investigators know they must protect the case even from their own outrage. Still, the frustration of dead ends accumulates. The offender remains faceless in any legally meaningful way. The search expands. The nation watches, and the house in Petaluma remains the fixed point everyone returns to in their minds. The place where a normal Friday night turned into a void no amount of effort has yet filled. This phase of the case is important because it reveals what investigations truly are before the breakthrough reshapes them in hindsight. They are not elegant, they are crowded, iterative, anxious, and often humiliating in the number of wrong doors they must open before reaching the right one. The myth of detective work prefers intuition and sudden revelation. Real life more often offers attrition. Detectives in the Polly Klaas case had to keep moving through attrition while the public imagination demanded miracle. That mismatch is one reason the dead-end phase feels so oppressive in retrospect. The clues were there, but not yet enough. The suspect pool was dangerous, but too broad. The fear was justified, but not yet resolved into proof. Every day seemed to intensify the moral urgency without simplifying the factual maze. And that is where Part 6 must leave the story. In the exhausting middle distance between outrage and answer, the case has become national. The evidence has begun to speak, but not clearly enough. The investigation is active, wide, and burdened by false hope. Detectives are circling the truth without holding it. The family is enduring the slow violence of uncertainty. And somewhere beyond the noise of tips, cameras, and procedural effort, the man who took Polly is still, for the moment, only a shape inside other people's fear. Not yet a name, not yet fully caught by the net that keeps tightening around him.